everyone. Today we're going to talk about one kind of moral perspective. A moral perspective is an approach to understanding moral issues. It generally gives us an outline or a guidebook or decision procedure for thinking about and evaluating some kind of moral problem. When we are presented with or find ourselves in a moral situation, we oftentimes need to make a decision. And in order to do this, we need to identify what is morally relevant and make a moral judgment. The moral perspective we're going to talk about today is called Kantian ethics, and it is derived from the work of the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant. This moral perspective on moral theory is considered to be one of the greatest moral theories in Western philosophy. Kant's theory of ethics is vast and too hard for us to cover explicitly. Nevertheless, there are many central points that we can get a solid grasp on and use to analyze moral problems we may face in the working world. His theory of ethics not only provides us with clear foundations for ethics, but also good tools for identifying moral issues, analyzing them, and making a decision about what to do. Since much of his work is controversial, I will only be presenting a sketch of some of the central components and an outline of a related ethical perspective known as the moral rights tradition. So let me begin by locating Kantian ethics within a classification of general kinds of moral perspectives. By doing this, we will see what kind of moral perspective Kant is giving us. Moral theories can be classified in terms of the kind of thing they take to be the object of moral evaluation. That is, the thing in virtue of which something is said to be moral. One kind of moral theory takes persons to be the primary objects of moral evaluation, while another kind of moral theory takes actions to be the primary objects of moral evaluation. When a moral theory takes persons to be the primary object of moral evaluation, the fundamental issue is over what it is to be a good person and to live a good life. When a moral theory takes actions to be the primary objects of moral evaluation, the fundamental issue is whether a specific action is morally good, such as donating money to the poor. In addition to that basic distinction of the theories that take action to be primary objects of moral evaluation, there is a further distinction that can be made on the basis of what is used to determine whether an action is morally good, permissible, or obligated. One kind of action-based theory of moral evaluation is consequentialist. A consequentialist theory holds that an action is morally good in virtue of the consequences of the action and not in virtue of the intentions of the agent in performing the action. A non-consequentialist theory holds that an action is good in virtue of some feature other than the consequences of the action. One common feature that is cited is the agent's intention in performing the action. Here is a classification of different kinds of moral perspectives. On the one hand, we have action-oriented moral theories, and on the other hand, we have person-oriented moral theories. Of the theories that are action-oriented, they can be classified as either being consequentialist or non-consequentialist. Person-oriented theories typically tend to be virtue-oriented. Consider some action. Each action has two components. One component is the intention, and the other component is the consequences. We may imagine all of the following situations being part of an action. On the one hand, the action has positive intentions and negative consequences. On the other hand, it can have negative intentions and positive consequences. And yet still, it can have positive intentions, positive consequences, as well as negative intentions and negative consequences. Kant's moral theory is an action-based theory of ethics, as opposed to a person-oriented moral theory, and it is a non-consequentialist theory. It takes actions to be the primary objects of moral evaluation. However, it does not take consequences to be of central importance. Rather, the central feature of an action that it takes to be of importance is the intentions that went into the action. From the Kantian moral perspective, whether an action is morally good or not depends primarily on the intentions of the agent performing the action. All of the situations listed above are possible with regard to action. That is, we can have an individual that commits an action with good intentions, but for some reason or other, the consequences are negative. For example, in trying to save someone by pushing them out of the way of a runaway train, I may end up killing them because I pushed them into a car making a left turn. Or we could have a case in which I intend to kill someone, but for some reason or other, I end up saving them. For example, suppose I give someone a poison at dinner. However, the dish they ordered is actually one that is going to kill them because of some allergic reaction. But the poison I gave them is actually an antidote for the allergic substance in the dish. So though I intended to kill them, I end up saving them. And of course, there are situations in which both intentions and consequences are negative, and situations in which both the intentions and consequences are positive. Successfully killing an innocent person for the fun of it is a good instance of bad intentions and bad consequences. And successfully saving someone from being tortured when you can do so, and because morality demands it, is perhaps a case in which intentions and consequences are good. Remember, on Kant's view, what matters most in determining whether an action is moral is the intentions that go into the action, and not the consequences. Now let us move into some of the basics of Kant's moral theory. One basic question that needs to be answered is the following. What makes an action a moral action? For example, scratching my nose because it itches is not a particularly moral or immoral action. It appears as if morality doesn't apply to it. Closing the blinds in my house because it is too sunny also appears to be not really that moral or immoral. However, what about helping someone across the street because it makes me feel good, or saving a drowning child because I want a good reputation? Again, the question is, what makes an action a moral action? To get Kant's answer to this, let us look at an actual example he uses. Suppose you are a shopkeeper and could overcharge an inexperienced customer and make more money off of him. However, you decide not to do so. That is, you fairly charge him, although you could get away with charging him more for the product. Now, let us consider 3 possible reasons you might give for doing this action. What is the action? Fairly charging the customer. Reason in the first case. Because it makes me feel good to be fair. Reason. Because if others found out I was an unfair shopkeeper, I would lose business. 3. My reason is because it is the right thing to do. The moral law demands that I do this out of principle. That is, I choose to fairly charge the customer because it just simply is the right thing to do. In all of the cases, the action is the same. However, Kant holds that only in case 3 is the action a moral action. Cases 1 and 2 are simply not moral actions. In case 1, your action is based on an immediate feeling of a certain kind. You do the action because it makes you feel good. You are motivated to do the action because it makes you feel good. In case 2, you have a desire to avoid a bad consequence, and it is that desire that motivates the action. However, in 3, you are motivated to do the action because it simply is the right thing to do, deriving directly from the moral law. So why does Kant hold that 1 and 2 are not moral actions? The consequences were the same as 3. The actions were in accordance with what the moral law requires us to do, be fair. His basic reason for holding that 1 and 2 are not moral is because each one is based on something that is contingent. Because 1 and 2 are based on something that is contingent, they do not apply universally and necessarily to all human subjects. Let me now draw out Kant's central conception of morality. Kant holds that there is a moral law that is universal and timeless, like the laws that govern mathematics and physics. Here is a line of reasoning Kant would use to show that 1 and 2 are not moral actions. His line of reasoning would be the following. Morality is universal and necessary. Thus, if an action is a moral action, it must be based on something that is universally applicable and necessary to all humans. Specific desires are not universal and necessary, so no action based on having specific desires can be universal and necessary. So no action based on having specific desires is a moral action. Returning to our example, Kant basically holds that if you decide not to overcharge the customer because of some desire you have, such as the desire not to be deemed an unfair shopkeeper, or the desire to feel good because being fair makes you feel good, then your action is based on something that is contingent, that is, non-necessary, and potentially not universal, which makes the action lack moral value. In general, for Kant, when an action is based on desire, it is contingent, and thus not universal and necessary. Why are desires contingent? Desires are contingent for two distinct reasons. First, people have different desires. Second, a single person may not have the same desires over time. For example, if you decided to not overcharge the customer simply because it didn't feel good on Tuesday to do so, then what if on Wednesday it did? If not overcharging the customer flows from a desire that you don't have on Wednesday, you're going to overcharge the customer and therefore commit a morally bad action. The problem is that the action would not be grounded in something stable over time, because it is based on a desire that can change over time. In addition, perhaps you feel good when you don't overcharge your customers, but perhaps another shopkeeper feels great when he gets away with swindling a naive customer. If the morality of the action was based on having a certain desire, then we run into the problem that morality cannot be universal and applicable to everyone, since not everyone has the same desires. So, for Kant, an action is moral when it is done from duty, that is, when it derives from the moral law. The idea is rather strong. Many times you can do an action that has good consequences and maybe even neutral desires, such as wanting to be fair. Yet Kant's view is that the action is moral only when it comes from duty and the moral law. Now that we've got the core conception of what makes an action moral for Kant, let us look at some of the tools Kant provides us for thinking about morality. In particular, tools for thinking about what kinds of intentions are intentions that can be acted upon. Kant's main principle that governs actions and intentions is his categorical imperative. There are four distinct versions of this principle. We will be looking at the two most commonly used formulations. Here is Kant's universal formulation. It states, "Act only on those maxims which can be willed to be a universal law without contradiction." Kant's universal formulation of the categorical imperative is a filter that can be used to take out maxims that we cannot act on. A maxim is a technical term in Kant's philosophy. It refers to a subjective principle of action. A maxim is basically a full specified intention for committing an action. A maxim has a general form, I will do action A in circumstance C in order to achieve end E. Kant's universal formulation tells us that we cannot act on maxims which cannot be turned into universal laws applicable to all humans. Kant's basic idea is that if a maxim, when universalized, leads to a contradiction, then it is impossible for it to apply to all humans. The classic example that is used to show how the principle is applied and determines that we cannot act on a specific maxim is the case of making false promises. Suppose the following occurs. I make a false promise that I will repay a loan in a situation in which I know I won't have money to repay a loan. We might ask ourselves, can that maxim be universalized without contradiction? In the universal form, it looks like this. Everyone will make a false promise to repay a loan in a situation in which they don't have money to repay the loan. Now, we ask ourselves, is there an explicit or implicit contradiction here? The answer is that there is a contradiction here. The only way that the institution of lending can work is if people keep their promises. If people always broke their promises, then no one would ever take anyone's promises seriously. If no one ever took anyone's promises seriously, then no one would ever lend anyone money on the promise that they would pay them back. And so there would be no institution of lending for one to make a false promise to in order to get a loan. Whenever we act and look at the actions of others, there are three things we can do. Formulate the maxim we're acting under. It will have the form, I will perform act A in circumstance C in order to achieve end E. We can universalize the maxim, that is, look at it in a form where it applies to everyone, such as everyone will perform act A in circumstance C in order to achieve end E. C. We can look for contradictions in the universal form. If there are contradictions in the universal form, then we know we cannot act on that maxim. Since if a maxim leads to contradiction, it is one that we cannot act upon. The universal formulation basically leads to some simple questions we should ask when attempting to determine whether we can act on a certain maxim. Is the maxim one that everyone can act on without contradiction? Would I accept someone acting toward me with this maxim? Kant also offers us a second formulation of the categorical imperative. The second formulation is much easier to operate with and use as a guide to determining if something morally problematic is at play in a given scenario. Humanity formulation. Act always so as to treat another never as a means only, but as an end in themselves. Kant's humanity formulation allows us to focus on 2 points of importance to his moral philosophy. First point, don't use people merely as a means to some goal you want to achieve without taking into consideration the fact that they are an end in themselves. Second point, persons are basic entities of respect, so in a given situation we can ask ourselves 2 questions. In performing the action I am performing and acting under the specific intention I am acting under, am I using anyone merely as a means to an end and failing to treat them as an end in themselves? In performing the action I am performing and acting under the specific intention I am acting under, am I taking into account that persons are basic objects of respect? If an action you or another take fails in either of these ways, then the action is not morally permissible. In order to understand Kant's second formulation in more detail, we need to introduce the idea of fully informed rational consent. To rationally consent to something is to agree to something based on reasoning about it. Here is an example that brings out the need for this idea. Suppose you go to the post office to buy a stamp by paying the postal clerk. In performing that action, you are in some clear sense using the postal clerk as a means to an end. The end is acquiring stamps. The mean is paying the postal clerk. So should we say that you can't buy stamps from the postal clerk because you used him as a means to an end? The answer is no. Because the postal worker rationally consents to being used in this way, you are not merely using him as a means to an end. The postal worker rationally consents to being an employee of the post office, whereby he sells his labor for a salary. Contrast this case with the case in which someone robs you. Suppose a robber comes up to you and puts a gun in your back and says, "Give me all of your money, or else I will shoot you." In this case, he is using you as a means to an end. The end is acquiring your money. The means is threatening your life. Question: how is this case different from the postal worker case? Well, the central difference is that you didn't rationally consent to being treated this way, and you wouldn't rationally consent to being treated this way. Basically, you didn't rationally consent to have your life threatened as a means to acquiring money. So the robber is treating you as a means to an end. So one of the key issues raised by the humanity formulation is what we need to be careful about, whether the person involved did or would rationally consent to being treated in a certain way. Now, we need to ask a question. Does the idea of rational consent lead to the idea that if someone rationally consents to being treated a certain way, then it is okay for you to treat them that way? Kant answers this in the negative. There are limits on rational consent. Kant does not hold that one can rationally consent to everything. For example, he maintains that one cannot rationally consent to being killed. And we might also add that one cannot rationally consent to being a slave. In both of these cases, one rationally consents to something that undermines what it is to be a human in the world, that can be a source of value for things in the world. We will come toward the end of this lecture to see why this is important. Finally, as a condition on the notion of rational consent, we have to introduce the idea of fully informed rational consent. I might rationally consent to do something because I am not fully informed of all of the factors involved. However, were I fully informed, I would not rationally consent. For example, as a soldier in the military, I may rationally consent to follow some order, such as bombing a village because it contains a weapon depot. However, I may not rationally consent to carry out this order were I fully informed that women and children lived in the village as well. So rational consent is information relative, and in general we have an obligation to provide as much information as possible. Stemming from the Kantian tradition in moral philosophy is another tradition, the moral rights tradition. This is a tradition that sees moral rights as fundamental to understanding persons and relations amongst persons. In order to understand this tradition, we need to get clear on the central features of moral rights. Some of the features of moral rights are the following. They are distinct from legal rights. They apply universally to all persons. Societies are required to enforce both legal rights and moral rights. Rights imply duties. Rights cannot be waived. And rights cannot be overridden. Let me explain each of these. First and foremost, we need to distinguish between moral rights and legal rights. A legal right is a right that attaches to a person in virtue of their citizenship in a certain country, governed by a specific legal code or system. Since some laws are local and not global, legal rights can often be thought of as relative to legal systems. For example, it is legal to smoke cannabis in the Netherlands. However, it is illegal to smoke cannabis in the US. However, regardless of the legal question, one might ask the following. Do we have an explicit moral right or an implicit moral right that derives from other basic rights to smoke cannabis? In contrast with legal rights, moral rights are conceived of as being universal and independent of legal systems. The universality and non-dependence of moral rights on legal systems brings Kant's philosophy into focus. Recall that a central feature of Kant's conception of morality is that it applies to everyone and takes persons as ends themselves as central to the theory. Another important feature of moral rights is that just like legal rights, a society is required to enforce them. The reason why a society is required to enforce them is because the citizens of the society are first and foremost persons. And as persons, they have moral obligations and moral rights to one another. So a society must not only enforce legal rights, it must also enforce moral rights. Now that we have a bit about moral rights on the table, I want to discuss in detail one typical moral right, the right to life, and various conceptions of it. There are two conceptions of the right to life, a negative conception and a positive conception. On the negative conception, we have the following definition. If P has a right to X, then everyone else is required to refrain from interfering with P's having X. On the positive conception, we have the following definition. If person P has a right to X, then everyone else is required to refrain from interfering with P's having X, and should cooperate when necessary in P's having X. On the negative conception, a person's right to something is understood as a duty on the part of everyone else to refrain from interfering with the person's right to the thing. So if I have a moral right to life, then everyone else has a moral duty to refrain from interfering with my right to life. On the positive conception, a person's right to something has both a refraining component and an additional positive component. The positive component is the duty for others, when necessary, to cooperate with a given person in the pursuit of their right. There is a typical example that brings in the positive conception of the right to life. The example is the following. Suppose you are over at a friend's house eating lunch out by the pool. Your friend's 2-year-old daughter is playing by the pool. Your friend goes inside to prepare the lunch. While your friend is inside, the 2-year-old jumps in the pool, hitting her head against the side of it. She is knocked unconscious and proceeds to drown. You could simply pick her up out of the pool, but rather you watch her drown. On the negative conception of the right to life, you really haven't done anything wrong. On the negative conception of the right to life, the child only has a right to not be killed, which imposes on you the duty to not interfere with her pursuit of life. However, you do not have a duty to save her if her life is in peril. That is, the negative conception of rights does not require you to jump into the pool and save the child. However, something seems to be wrong here. From a moral point of view, you have done something wrong. You have let someone die who you could have saved without imposing any great cost to yourself. It appears that when you can save someone with no great cost to yourself, we are inclined to think that you have a moral obligation to do so. And this may even extend to cases where the cost is quite great to you. The positive conception of rights takes this into account. It has the additional requirement that you reach in and save the child. On the positive conception, you must also cooperate with the child's right to life by aiding her through saving her. So there are competing conceptions of rights. It is good to keep in mind the difference between the two. When analyzing a moral dilemma, you should ask yourself the following questions. What moral rights are at play? Under the negative conception of rights, what rights are being violated? Under the positive conception of rights, what rights are being violated? Of course, all of this depends on what moral rights we have. There is agreement over some, such as the moral right to life. However, there is disagreement over others, such as whether there is a moral right to work. That is, do we have a moral right to gainful employment? Finally, we come to two additional characteristics of moral rights that are central. Moral rights cannot be waived. For example, your moral right to life cannot be waived and taken out of consideration. This is because it applies to you necessarily in virtue of you being a person. In this situation, we must acknowledge the primacy of Mary's right to life over John's right to free speech. Mary's right is a moral right. John's right is arguably a civil or political right rather than a moral right. Now that we have a good conception of the general features of moral rights and how actually to look at one particular moral right, the right to life, we might further wonder what kinds of things have moral rights. This is a tough question to answer. Full discussion takes us out of the field of moral theory and into metaphysics and the philosophy of mind. However, there are some basic things that can be said, and we can close by looking at the answer that Kant gave. First, it should be noted that moral rights attach to persons. However, the use of persons here is technical. When we normally use the word person, we are talking about humans. However, it is an open question whether non-humans are persons. First, in the most obvious case, consider your dog. If your dog is a person, then your dog has moral rights. And if you don't think your dog is a person, then it doesn't have moral rights. Second, in a not so obvious case, it's an open question whether artificially intelligent systems could ever be persons. Could computers ever be persons? Think of movies like AI. In another, not so obvious, but yet still closer case, what about Star Trek adventures? Oftentimes, Kirk, Spock, and company go to a distant galaxy and discover new creatures. There is an open question they have to ask themselves. Are the creatures we have discovered persons? If so, then those creatures have moral rights. I know this sounds far-fetched, but in the future we may be able to explore distant galaxies, and if we were to discover a new species of life, we would have to wonder whether those creatures are persons, and as a consequence, how we should treat them. So if moral rights attach to persons, it appears that we need to know what a person is. What constitutes being a person? Are non-human animals persons? Could computers become persons? Kant answered the question of personhood as connected to morality by using a historically famous criterion. Kant held that the capacity to reason is the basis of personhood and morality. It is a necessary condition on something's being a person that it be capable of reasoning. So for Kant, your favorite non-human animal does not have moral rights, since it does not have the capacity to reason. When Kant thinks about reasoning, he means both the capacity to engage in theoretical and practical reasoning. Examples of theoretical reasoning include reasoning about how to perform a scientific experiment, doing mathematics, solving a puzzle, forming beliefs about religion. Examples of practical reasoning include planning for the future, figuring out how to satisfy your desires, and figuring out what to desire in the first place. In addition, Kant thought that reasoning was important because it explained our freedom to choose what to value. We can bring value into the world freely since reasoning is part of our freedom. However, one could disagree with Kant and hold that reasoning is not the relevant condition on being a person, especially when we are talking about person in the moral agent sense. Rather, the capacity to suffer and have interests is the relevant condition. For example, animals may not be able to reason, but they can suffer and feel pain. As a consequence, they have an interest in not being harmed. They may be limited moral agents in comparison to us because they cannot engage in reasoning with us about what to value and how to form societies, but that doesn't mean that they do not have an interest that should be of equal consideration to our own interests. So what it is to be a person is a controversial issue, and it is important because it relates to issues about what kinds of things have moral rights. So, to close, here is a review of the main points of Kant's theory. What is central to Kant's picture of morality is the idea that persons are basic entities in the world that command respect, and that whether an action is morally good depends on the intentions that went into the action. As a consequence, when you are looking to analyze a moral situation from the Kantian point of view, you should ask yourself the following questions. First, what were the intentions of the agents involved? Second, were the agent's intentions straightforwardly bad? Third, were the agents acting on maxims that could apply to everyone without contradiction? Fourth, were any of the parties involved explicitly being used? Fifth, were any moral rights violated? Sixth, were the parties involved fully informed? Did they rashly consent? Would they have rashly consented? Finally, Kant's categorical imperative and the questions above do not provide an algorithm for determining whether an action is morally wrong or right. Rather, they provide us with tools for critically thinking, analyzing, and aiding our own judgments about the moral status of a given situation. So please don't use Kant's theory as an excuse not to reason about morality, for that would be quite contrary to Kant's own foundation for morality, our capacity to reason and be responsive to each other.